Hello, and welcome to our lecture today on Jain Tirthankaras. So what's a Tirthankara or Tirthankara? Tirthankaras are ones who have made a ford or a crossing. So let's get into it. As you notice here, we often see Jains depicted when they depict their Tirthankaras as standing. You'll see them in two positions. You'll see them standing and you'll see them sitting. For my money, when I'm in India, I think that Jain sculpture is some of the most beautiful around. This is a picture, I believe, from Ellora, which has just some stunning Jain temples. They just, I don't know if it's because the Jains just had more money than the other groups, or because they were a minority and they wanted to build prestige, but they have just some of the most beautiful stone carvings, despite the fact that their deities are quite simple. You'll see that the adornments are just lovely. So what's a Tirthankara? So a Tirthankara means one who makes the crossing. Like here you see a bridge. So they're like a bridge builder. One who made the crossing, made the ford. Like when you ford a river, is like walk across the river, like right through it with your wagons and your whatnot. But this word tirtha meaning ford, tirthas can also be sort of places where people do worship. It can also be a riverbank. A tirtha can also be a community of people. It can also be the doctrine itself in any religion can be called a tirtha. Now, one thing to understand about these Tirthankaras is they are not avatars by any means. They are not, they're more like prophets, if anything, but there's sort of a unique version of prophets for Jainism. They are human beings who have become omniscient. They sure, they're born and they have this sort of incredible physicality. They're said to have very strong divine bodies. Well, not divine bodies, but very strong divine-like bodies in order to be able to do the incredibly painful religious practices that will allow them to attain omniscience. So there's 24 Tirthankaras in total in every sort of cycle of worldly existence. Now, what happens, like I talked about yugas before, and there are 4 ages in Hinduism, going from a golden age to this lesser age that we're in now, the Kali Yuga, which is the age of degeneration. In Jainism, you have the wheel of time has 6 spokes, and in 3 of which there's sort of rising. It's called Utsarpani. Sarpani from to creep, srip. Also the word sarpa, snake, and then of course then we also have serpent in English as Indo-European. So there are these 6 sort of chunks of time that get progressively shorter. And in those chunks of time, the first 3, everything's pretty good. So it's at the end of that first 3, that the first Tirthankara Rishabha shows up. And then you have the 3 where they're kind of going downward, these ages of degeneration. And we're in the sort of last, depending on who you talk to, last or second to last. So either we're in the age of degeneration when there will be no more Tirthankaras, or if you talk to other people, they'll say that there's another era coming in which Jainism will be completely eclipsed. But either way, we are in the degenerate time. The first Tirthankara comes within the 3rd Utsarpani, so the rising good times. And then our last Tirthankara, Mahavir, there won't be any more. And he came as we're definitely in this degenerate time that we live in now. So only 2 of these Tirthankaras are historical figures. That would be Parshva or Parshvanatha and Mahavira. So the rest that we see, these 22 other names are sort of like, I mean, when we see the earliest version of this, they're just a list of names with nothing about them. What we see with Parshvanatha and Mahavira is we have the most elaborate biographies. We also see that Parshvanatha's biography is most likely based on Mahavira's, and all of the other Tirthankara's biographies are sort of different versions of the exact same events that you see in Mahavira's biography. Sorry, excuse me. In the medieval period, that's when all of these different Tirthankaras start having stories told about their whole lives, usually dedicating to this Pancha Kalyanaka, the 5 auspicious events, which are conception, and then birth, and then renunciation, and then achieving omniscience, and then finally moksha, liberation at death. Okay, so according to the Shwetambaras, which name means white clad, so there's two divisions of Jains and Jain monks, so the Shwetambaras and the Digambaras, and that's going to be the subject of a lesson coming up. So the Shwetambaras are ones who are white clad. They're clad only in a little bit of white. And the Digambaras are the naked guys. They're clad only in the sky, only in the directions. So Mahavira and Rishabha, according to the Shwetambaras, were fully naked, but the rest all wore clothes. The Digambaras, of course, because they believe in nude monks, are going to argue that everybody was naked. If we remember from the story of Mahavira, when he renounces, he's given a celestial cloth by the gods, but over time he gives that to someone else. He's like, I don't need this. I need to have absolutely no possessions, including clothing. So as I'd said before, we have this Panch Kalyanik. When they enter the womb, when they renounce, when they attain omniscience, this is also the time they start teaching, and when they reach death or moksha, when they die. So these Panch Kalyanika, and what you'll often see is you'll see this big table that'll have like all the names of the Tirthankaras, and then it'll have like the date and the location of each one of these Panch Kalyanikas, of these 5 events. And for some of them, that's all we got. Like Chandraprabha, that's all we have about him. And we're not really going to talk about that. Or Malina, I mean, that's it. We know, boom, the 5 events, where they were, and that's it. There's no other stories about it. Even though with Parshvanatha and Mahavira and Rishabha, we actually have extensive stories around these specific events. All right, so each one of these Tirthankaras is attended to by what they call a Shashana Devi, or which means something like attendant or supporting deity. They're usually Yakshinis and Yakshas, so male and female Yakshas, or Naganis and Nagas, so snakes. These are sort of a nod toward popular worship, and we'll actually see that a lot of the iconography in both Buddhism and Jainism of deities comes out of local cults to Yakshinis and Naganis. These also, there's the idea that these Tirthankaras are no longer present. They're in the Siddhaloka, so you can't really interact with them in any way, but you can interact with their attendant deities. And if you pay attention, you can see sort of that not only like with these Shramana, these striver religions that we talked about before, that they do have these connections to Yaksha cults. As I mentioned earlier, our earliest evidence of linga worship, so Shiva's phallic symbol, was associated with Yakshas. Then we see that the Bodhisattvas and Mahayana, almost all of them are associated with, they have names like Vajrapani and Vajradhara that were earlier, they were Yaksha names. So all of these groups have an appeal to these local cults, to Yakshas or tree spirits, and they also incorporate Nagas, as we talked about extensively at Ajanta. Okay, so usually these Tirthankaras are worshipped in the collective, or if they're talked about, they just talk about the 24. You'll see 24 images of jinnas all over the place. But if you ask people like, well, what are that? They'll say, oh, they're the Tirthankaras. And like, well, which one's which? And like, I don't know. You can tell Rishabha because he has long hair, and that's about it. I mean, you can tell because they'll have like a bull or they'll have like a symbol associated with them, whether it's like a crescent moon or a bull or a wheel. So these are one way to tell them apart, but usually there's no way to tell the difference between these different these different Tirthankaras when they're being depicted, especially in stone. So a few are described individually in order to tell sort of didactic tales that tell lessons and whatnot, or in order to talk about the glories of their mantras, as we read about in our stories of miraculous powers. So you'll have details about these different Tirthankaras in order to make relevant the devotion to them and to using their mantras for either spiritual development or practical gains, like being able to convert a god or get out of a trap or get out of captivity or whatnot. The majority of them, or all of them, live in the Siddhaloka, so this land of the liberated jivas, and theoretically you can't interact with them at all because they are not moving, they're not generating karmas anymore. However, with the Tirthankaras, like nobody actually we'll talk about like praying to Mahavira for good luck, but these Tirthankaras are ways that people are able to kind of sneak in a devotionalism, and Jains are able to find ways to interact with these ostensibly untouched and untouchable entities. So in a way, the Tirthankaras are more present than Mahavira, the founder, is. So the most important of these, the ones that we actually have stories on that I'm going to go over today, are these 5. So you have Rishabhanatha, which means something like the bull lord. You'll notice that they all have Nath at the end. Remember the Nath yogis before. Nath or Natha means lord. Then you have Neminath and Malinath. Those aren't really well translatable. Parshvanatha means something like the side or the wing, sometimes the branch. Nath, and then Mahavir, the great hero, the great virile one, if you will. So Rishabhanath, the bull, his name means bull, and he's actually associated with, in the Rig Veda, there's a couple of seer, well, there's one seer named Rishabha. So the thought is that when they sort of decided to figure out who this first Natha would be, they should look as far as they could into the past, and they found this name of this very old seer in the Rig Veda, so Rishabha. This is some of our speculation on this. I mean, maybe he just existed and that was his name, but you know, historicity, what are you going to do? I mean, this is all about telling stories. That's what it's really about. You can see that he's associated with Shiva. He's always depicted with matted locks, so like dreadlocks, as is Shiva. He's depicted with a bull. Shiva's bull is named Nandi, so Shiva is associated with a bull. Some of his early names that you also see for him is Adinath, or the first lord. Also Keshan Yogi, which means like the hairy yogi, the hairy guy. So I like this picture of this bull here because it shows you 2 things. One, Rishabha is associated with bulls, but also look, he's got hair. So the story is that supposedly when he renounced, Indra, I don't know, liked his hair so much, they said, don't cut all your hair off. And Rishabhanath said, okay, I won't. So the deal with Rishabhanath is he's a demiurge. So he's someone who has brought culture to the world. He is both a spiritual hero and a cultural hero. And the idea is that before he renounced, he taught swordsmanship, the skill of swordsmanship. Some people say only for defense, but what's going on here is he's giving technologies that would have made sense for people in the world. He's bringing culture to humanity, which is uncultured. And one of those big sciences would be swordcraft. And I would also venture to add military. He also gave a couple of other things that are sort of important, like writing. He taught people how to write. Now, even though we know that Indians have really only been writing since about 1500 BCE, well, that's millions and millions of years ago, Rishabhanath taught people how to write. So writing is important. Agriculture. So this is an interesting point. In India, when you see, and we'll see this with Islam quite a bit, when you see an area that is sort of uncultured or tribal, or it's not connected to sort of the world, one of the first things that people do, these charismatic saints that would go out there to sort of convert people, is they wouldn't convert them all that much, is they would teach them agriculture. So agriculture and the teaching of agriculture becomes a way to show religious validity behind the person that teaches it. And in all of these descriptions of Rishabhanath, we see that he's giving these essential technologies for living in the world that our entire culture as humans in any culture is based on. So he also taught, you know, the basics of science, vidya. It's hard to say what they mean by vidya, because vidya can mean wisdom, it means science, it can mean a magic spell. Vidya can mean a lot of things. Trade, and the Jains, we were big on trade. He also introduced fire and taught people how to cook. And then he also introduced professions like, I don't know, being a cook or being a sweeper or a tailor or whatnot. So he very much not only is the founder of, as the first initial Tirthankara, but he's the one that really gives humanity its human culturalness. So he supposedly was huge. He lived millions of years, and he was 1,200 feet tall. Now we'll see that over time, as the world degenerates, we get to Mahavir was only 10 feet tall. But you can see that with all of the different, with all of these different Tirthankaras, they get smaller and smaller and smaller and live progressively shorter lives. So I think Parshvanath was only, like 14 feet tall and lived for 100 years. And then Mahavir was 10 feet tall and only lived what was it, 72 years. So one of the interesting things about Rishabhanath is before he renounced, he had a wife and sons, and in fact, he had 2 sons, and one was named Bahubali. Now, we will actually see a whole bunch of monuments to Bahubali, like you see on the right here, throughout southern India. Now, he's not a Tirthankara, Bahubali. Bahubali was in a battle, and he was just winging away, killing people, and then he runs into his brother, and he's fighting with his brother, and he nearly deals a mortal blow, nearly kills his brother. And at that point, he goes, "Holy smokes, what am I doing?" And at that point, he realizes the truth of Jainism, and in time went to follow his father, Rishabhanath, and he also became a monk who attained a great deal of omniscience himself. And while he's not a Tirthankara, he is very much revered as a hero and an example of a perfect Jain. Okay, so Rishabha has an attendant. Now, I said that all of these Tirthankaras will have an attendant deity. His is Chakeshwari. Now, Chakra, her name will be Chakra with a long A, so the female Chakra. Chakra means wheel, or Chakeshwari, which means like mistress of the wheel. So I actually do see people talk about her quite a bit, and I don't see a lot of necessarily like depictions of her places, nor do you see a lot of depictions of Rishabha places, but you will find her, especially in like a lot of the magic texts that I talk about, that I read. Chakreshwari is often seen as being sort of an engine for magical success. So she, as I said, is often a recipient of devotion, and as we read in Tirthankaras' book, or short essay, that in fact she was able to help very important sort of Jain figures in the medieval era, where she gave them the power to bring forth the very deities like Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma, and convert them to, or at least have them bow to Jainism. There's another story in which she is able to help someone to, in fact, battle Durga, and as Durga is struck, she begins to cry, and at that point, Chakeshwari enables this Jain character to teach her about compassion, and then she becomes a compassionate Jain deity as well. You see a lot of this in Jainism, where Hindu deities will have an about-face change due to an event and will become Jains, and then as Jains, they also protect other Jains, and they also enable Jains to do sort of magical or mystical things. So we also heard the story of a very pious Jain king who was captured by a Muslim, and he was devoted to Chakreshwari. So she came forward and unloosed his chains and helped him to sneak out of the place and made him invisible. So Chakreshwari becomes a very important sort of deity associated with the Tirthankara, who is worshipped for worldly ends. Malinath, let's move this here. So we don't know anything about Malinath. I mean, I could go over the Panch Kalyanaka and where those things happen, but we don't know anything about it. This is how Malinath is depicted. Malinath you can see in various places, but here's the thing. Supposedly Malinath is female. The Digambaras are like, nope, no way. But the Shwetambaras are like, yeah, he was a she. He was female. I know that sounds so weird to say. But Malinath, we have this big argument about this 19th Tirthankara who is supposedly female, and people argue about it all the time, whether it's possible for a woman to be a Tirthankara, where the Shwetambaras are like, yeah, but there was really only one. And the Digambaras are like, no, not possible at all. There's a lot of reasons for this. I also kind of would like to note, though, that with Malinath, we only see her depicted as male, but we don't see, there's not really a precedent at the time for sculpting female figures unless they're goddesses or these attendant deities. But like a female ascetic, we rarely, if ever, see any stone depictions of females doing meditation or females looking like divinities other than, sort of standard goddess types. So the idea of a female Tirthankara, even with having the idea of a female Tirthankara, they didn't know how to depict her. So they just depicted her as him. So that's our 19th Tirthankara, who there continues to be a lot of debate about. Neminat. Now, Neminat is sort of interesting to me. I've always liked Neminat. So Neminat is the 22nd of the Tirthankaras, and is known for his love of animals. Also, he's always depicted in this very dark, and this dark skin. So is Parshvanatha, but he's thought to be blue, in fact. And he is always associated with a chakra. We don't see a chakra wheel in this picture here, unfortunately. Some of those little circles on him could be the chakra. It's hard to say. So there's this argument that, in fact, he is the brother of Krishna from the Mahabharata. And this is, I should note that the great Hindu epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, there are Jain versions of them, and they're beautiful, just gorgeous Sanskrit texts that retell these stories of war and battle and killing, but from a Jain perspective. So the characters keep, finding ways to renounce violence throughout them. The Jains continually take Hindu and sometimes Buddhist ideas and repackage them in a Jain manner in order that they can glorify Jainism. So it's like they hijack the story in order to bring it another way. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, this in another context. I'll let you just toy around with that idea. So he's associated with animals, but why is he associated with animals? Well, he was about to be married, and he was on his way to his wedding, and he saw people doing these sacrifices of animals for the good fortune of his wedding. In fact, it was the sounds of the animals screaming that upset him so much that he left his soon-to-be wife and went and became a monk. He renounced because he was so upset by the cruelty he saw in sacrifice, and by that extension, and meat eating. So remember that these Jain guys are all non-sacrificers, and they're all vegetarians. So there's a fair amount of sort of like popular temples to him where people will go and do worship for the well-being of their herds and for sick animals and whatnot. But that's the big story about Neminat. And as I said before, he's often depicted looking like Krishna, and is associated with a chakra. His attendant is Ambika, who you see all over the place, worshipped widely and for pragmatic results. And she and Padmavati, who we'll talk about in a minute, the attendant of Parshvanatha, is one of the deities most invoked in Jain magical traditions. Parshvanatha, the great Parshvanatha. So he's the 23rd Tirthankara, so we're rocking close to the 24th, who is Mahavira. He's associated with snakes. There are always snakes all over him. And you can see that he has the serpent's hood shielding him, just like the Buddha had a serpent's hood over his head. The idea is the Buddha was meditating all there, and a hailstorm came. And then the same guy, Dharanendra, the lord of the serpents, came and put his mighty hood over the Buddha to shelter him while meditating. So we'll talk about Dharanendra and Parshvanatha in just a minute. He was a historical figure. We're pretty sure of it, from the 8th to the 9th century. So, about 300-400 years, depending on how you render it, between him and Mahavira. He was 13 feet tall. And unlike Mahavira, there's all of these sort of traditions that aren't even folk traditions within Jainism of you can worship Parshvanatha and he'll help you out if you're in a jam. But there's also this wild argument that he might even be able to bestow salvation to you. And you're like, wait a minute. This is Jainism. You only get saved by your own personal merits and endeavors. Well, there's always a little higgly-piggly in these religious traditions. So there's a great tale about Parshvanatha. So in his life, he was a great soldier, and he renounced at the age of 30. But there's a story that when he was in a prior incarnation, he was performing a Vedic sacrifice to a fire, and a snake gets into the fiery Agni place, and he grabs with 2 tongs and gets the snake out, and he saves the snake's life. Well, that snake was actually Dharanendra, and the lord of all the snakes. In his life as Parshvanatha, however, he was meditating, and people started throwing rocks at him. There's like a whole bunch of Brahmins that were throwing rocks with him, messing with him and whatnot. And at that point, the snake Dharanendra comes and puts his hood over his head and protects him and guards Parshvanatha, because Parshvanatha had saved him in another life. There's lots of great variations on this tale. So Parshvanatha associated with Dharanendra, the lord of the serpents, and he always has a snake hood and stone carved depictions of him. And then he's surrounded by two attendant deities, or nagas and naganis. You have Padmavati, she who dwells within the Padma flower, the lotus flower, and Dharanendra, he is the Lord who upholds everything, or something like the same thing. But snakes, big divine snakes. So Dharanendra and Padmavati. So they're snakes. Sometimes they're also yakshas, and we see with all these Tirthankaras, as I keep saying, that they are, there's a connection to them in sort of local snake cults, which you see all over. So over here and here, those are your two snakes, snake attendants, but you also see the mighty hood of Dharanendra over this standing Parshvanatha. Also, you can see really well here his long arms that hang down below his knees. This is a sign of divinity. The Buddha had this too. Also, supposedly there's a hair that grows like a swirl out of the middle of his forehead, and having very long earlobes. So I have a teacher who would always say, it's like, well, someday when I'm in heaven, I want to ask the Buddha all of this and this. I'm like, you're a Catholic. All right, whatever. But then she would also start describing the different ways that the Buddha would look with his sort of divine attributes. And then I remember her just sort of chuckling, and she's a tiny little woman. She'd sort of shake her head, she'd say something in her thick Croatian accent. She would just say, yeah, I think he just looked like some sort of really weird guy. So that always amuses me when I think about that. So Dharanendra and Padmavati have these connections to yakshas and to nagas. They're associated with the Tirthankara. They're widely worshipped on their own. Padmavati all over the place, as is Ambika, and also you see them in Jain magical traditions. In fact, one of the most important Jain texts on magic is a text called the Bhairava Padmavati Kalpa. And in this text, it's dedicated to Parshvanatha, and Padmavati is that snaky attendant of his, and she is the one that helps you do the black magic. Yeah, Jain's doing magic to kill people. It's there. It's all right. So Parshvanatha. So historically, when we talk about him, we can guess that he founded some sort of proto-Jain community. And in fact, this proto-Jain community was the group of people that Mahavira's Mahavira's parents were involved in, as lay people in this sort of early cult to Parshvanatha. He had a founder. Parshvanatha had 4 vows instead of 5. So the Mahavrata, the 5 vows that the Mahavira taught. Here there are only 4, and they're like not stealing. They're not stealing, not killing, non-possession, and one other. But it's the important thing to note is that there was not celibacy, brahmacharya. So some people have argued that he didn't have that included because everybody just knew it anyway. Other people argue that Mahavira introduced to Jainism this notion that celibacy is required. Again, these are big debates that people have. So I will say once again that Dharanendra is important for devotion because he can aid in pragmatic events, and he can even save souls somehow. I'm not sure. Okay, Mahavira. So this is our guy. We've talked about him before. I just want to go over some key ideas. So the Shwetambaras, those guys who are dressed in white, say that he was born in 599. Digambaras say 510. The debate roars on. The sort of only other figures that were probably talked about as Jain Tirthankaras, even though they wouldn't have had that term at the time, would have been Parshva and we think maybe Rishabha. So a lot of people say that in Mahavira's past life, he was the heretical son of Rishabha. So you see I've got a heretic over there, clearly. They also say he was a lion. And why not have Mahavira as that great lion among men? Also, he was in a hell realm. He lived in a hell realm. So in his past lives, he got up to stuff until he became Mahavira. So I think one of the most interesting things about Mahavira is he was from this warrior class of Kshatriyas. And when he set up these communities, he called them sanghas or ganas. Both of these are terms that we see in Buddhism as well, but both of these are military terms for military units in an army. So as such, he was this sort of like ascetic warrior. He had sort of the ideals of a warrior, but his practice was asceticism. He was like a soldier monk who didn't do any soldiering, but put all of his soldiery energy into his ascetic practices. He's a sort of hybrid Brahmin Kshatriya, and we remember that he was originally born in a Brahmin's womb, or he was placed or conceived in a Brahmin's womb. And Indra was like, no. The only way he can be a Chakravartin, a great conqueror, and a Dharmavartin, a great religious figure, is if he is born in the womb of a Kshatriya. So Indra takes the fetus and plops it on over into a Kshatriya's womb. So he, in many ways, is both a Brahmin and a Kshatriya. And we see this in a lot of these Shramana groups, whereas the Hindus just revere the Brahmins as is. These Shramanas, these strivers, these Buddhists and Jains, are always trying to kind of be sort of like warrior style Brahmins. So there's a bunch of names for him. So his name was Vardhamana, but we think that came later, and that was put on him and his name for the one that increases. But we have his early names we've seen in the early scriptures are like Nyatri, one who knows stuff. Muni, one who is quiet and a monk-like guy. Samana, one who, I don't want to translate that one. Brahmin, like Brahmin. Vayavit, which is Vedavit, which is one who knows the Vedas. And then later, he gets called a Tirthankara. But these earlier names for him are just one who would have been generally considered to be very knowledgeable and holy. And our later terms, even the term Jinnah comes later. So in his enlightenment, it came about while he was sitting on his haunches. So that was his position. Remember that the Buddha was under a tree. I believe he was near an Ashoka tree. Mahavira was near an Ashoka tree, and the Buddha was under a Bodhi tree. So he's sitting on his haunches. He's been fasting and hasn't had water for 2.5 days. He's staring at the sun, of course naked. And then suddenly the Kevala Jnana comes on, and he becomes omniscient. Now, he describes all sorts of things with his omniscience, mundane things and spiritual things. And by being omniscient, this proves the truth of what he's saying and demonstrates the power of Jainism. The Buddha, in fact, would only talk about spiritual matters, but Mahavir talked about everything. So Kevala Jnana is both sort of a sign of his accomplishment and a proof of the truth of Jainism. So his first teachings were at a Chaitya of a guy named Purnabhadra. Now, Chaitya is sort of like a small shrine by a tree. And Purnabhadra, which also becomes the name of a bodhisattva later, is a yaksha. So again, where does he have his first teachings? He has them in by a tree shrine. And it's a tree shrine dedicated to Purnabhadra, who is a yaksha. So again, there's all this overlap of these sort of smaller, sort of local yaksha cults that both the Buddha and Mahavira were very knowingly sort of being involved with and associating themselves with. So when stories are told about Mahavira, they generally stress his sort of asceticism. He's sort of, like I said, he's an ascetic warrior. They describe his ascetic practices in the same way they would describe the work of someone on a battlefield. When we see that he is actively worshipped at things like the Mahavira Jayanti, we don't see him worshipped in a lot of temples, but there are festivals all over India, so that Mahavira Jayanti is sort of the commemoration of the birth of Mahavira. So people will even act out the sort of the Pancha Kalyanaka. So they'll actually have plays in which they act out the events of his life. But what do they really focus on more than anything is not descriptions or depictions of him teaching, and not his early life before he renounces, but most of when they act out stuff and tell stories about him, it's about that period between his renunciation and when he becomes liberated, when he becomes enlightened. So that's it for today, and I will talk to you soon. Enjoy yourself, be good to one another, be well.